Hello everyone, and you're all welcome to World Vegetarian Day 2018, an event organised by the Vegetarian Society of Ireland. Maureen's going to talk more about the organisation, and you're going to talk about the rights of vegetarians and vegans. So I'll just introduce Maureen and she can talk more about the Vegetarian Society and what we do. So Maureen O'Sullivan is Chairperson at the Vegetarian Society of Ireland. She's also a fellow at the Centre of Animal Ethics at the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics, and she's also a lecturer above the bar in law at NUI Galway. So over to Maureen.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot for that, Martin. So you're very welcome. Very nice to see you here today. So the Vegetarian Society of Ireland, in its current incarnation, has been in existence for 40 years. And what we do actually, it very much depends on the volunteers that we have. So a few years ago we had a very, very active social scene because there were a lot of people who used to organise events in Dublin, and at the moment we're probably more spread out around the country. I'm based in Galway, Martin is based in Dublin, and then we've also had volunteers who've helped us with the organisation of today. But we're actually quite low on volunteers at the moment, and it's just we go through different phases of, sometimes having maybe 8 people who are very active. At the moment we have 2 people who are relatively active, so if anybody can offer any help in that regard, it would be very very welcome. And again, it's kind of doing what you kind of like doing, really, I suppose. We've had people involved in the past in doing a magazine, but we found that it was an awful lot of input for very little output, in the sense that it's very, very time consuming. It always runs at a loss. We have a budget of under 10,000 a year, and it was costing us about 1,000, I think. And then there were kind of logistics like packing and stuff like that. And then with the switch to social media, what would often happen is that somebody would write an article and it wouldn't get published for about a year. So, if it was a review of a restaurant, for example, the restaurant might have gone out of business or shut down or whatever. So we switched over to using the internet a lot more, our website, and also Facebook. And so that's where we are at the moment, 40 years old, and certainly going through a lot of changes. I wouldn't exactly call it a crisis, but we're still going strong and very committed to what we're doing as well, which is nice. There's a very nice community as well, I think, around the Vegetarian Society of Ireland, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the text of my talk. So kind of what I've decided to do here is just to bundle together a number of different things. The rights of vegetarians and vegans is a topic that's become more of an issue with a rise in the number of vegans, and I suppose the number of challenges that we've seen, especially in the last year. The dairy industry obviously is suffering quite a bit, and in some aspects of the dairy industry they're going with the trend. So you have companies like Danone that bought up Alpro, which I thought was a very intelligent move, because now when you go into any of the supermarkets, it's not just in the fridge section but also on the shelf section. There are about 10 or 12 different alternative milks. There are other places then, or other organisations, that have decided to stick their heels in and not go with the trend, and we'll see how that plays out ultimately, but to start to sort of fight directly. And obviously we've had a number of issues this year with the national broadcaster having a number of different programmes which were misleading and definitely in violation of the law, even though when we challenged them they refuted that. But anyway, so we're going to tie down the law here today in this talk, so that you will be able to go out and be very clear about what it actually protects. And I came up with this title because I talk about a different aspect of us and our work every year, and it's just been that this has been something that's crystallised this year, so I thought it would be of interest. And then I called it Protein-landia because the current trend is, where do you get your protein? But I've been vegan for 31 years, and we've gone through such a whole host of different trends. And the protein thing, for me it's a marketing device that replaced omega-3, that replaced D3, that replaced a particular type of B12. So anyway, I'm not a nutritionist, so anything I say with regard to nutrition, I wouldn't seek to be bound by it, but it's just kind of based on my observations and stuff like that. You can make whatever you want of it yourselves. So then I suppose we get to the question of, I'm a lawyer, so I always like to define my terms exactly. So what are vegetarians? Actually, when you look back on this, the word has been used very differently. Until the coining of the term veganism, vegetarianism was a broad term used to cover different diets. So some people used it to describe plant-based only, and other people used to describe it as plant-based plus milk. So, for example, in Indian communities, a lot of vegetarians are what we would know as lacto-vegetarians, but they don't eat eggs, for example. There are other vegetarians that don't eat dairy and they do eat eggs. They never eat fish. Like in any definition of vegetarianism, fish is never included. So, and, obviously that's a problem then if you've got a restaurant advertising their vegetarian option and they're throwing every sort of thing in there, like salmon or oysters or even, and I say Thai curries in particular because they tend to have fish paste already in the paste and they're labelling them as vegetarian, and they shouldn't do that. There is some confusion on social media about that, but anyway, that's like, look at the definition that we have of ourselves or that the UK Vegetarian Society has, and you'll see that it doesn't sanction the killing of animals for meat. So what I'm saying is it's a quite a broad definition. It's become probably a bit more or less specific depending on how you see it since the coining of veganism in the 1940s. It is now a controversial term. We do have discussions on the committee and with other participants as to, are we going in a direction or are we in a particular place? And I've been a vegan for 31 years. I actually like the incarnation of the society as we have it, just simply because of the people that we attract. We're like a door that a lot of curious people come through. And when we've had meetings in a lot of like meetups in Dublin a few years ago, one of the things that I found was a lot of people are curious. So they might be meat eaters who are just experimental. They want to see what food is out there, and we're an open door. And I'm not saying that that's the only way. In fact, I think it's a mistake to think that there's just one way of getting your message across. And whether we all have the same message or not, well, we clearly don't, because the committee has always been a mix of vegans and vegetarians. And so then, as I say, the term does come up as one, attracting a certain amount of controversy. So, and I suppose the other thing too about social media, especially in the last 2 years, is it is making a much stronger connection between the dairy industry and the meat industry. So I think that's actually an awful lot harder to ignore. Fortunately, because I have been a vegan for so long, I'm not actually having to look at that at all. Do you know what I mean? But I think it is certainly one that people are becoming increasingly aware of. And I just actually included this picture. I was in Mexico City a few years ago and I saw this a bunch of dancers, and I was just kind of looking at what they were dressed in, and it was obviously a lot of animal skins, feathers, and there's a human skull there as well. So I didn't ask them about the provenance or anything like that. But obviously the byproducts of animals as well is something that vegetarian societies wouldn't sanction, but then sometimes there can be cultural issues that I suppose we haven't really delved into that. And then there's a variety of reasons why people start this route. In surveys that we've done in the past, it's almost always for health. I think it's understandable. Humans are self-interested, so it's often a health issue. It can be religion. So, for example, if there's a belief in reincarnation, or even one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, it doesn't actually tell you what you don't kill or what you shouldn't kill. And I want to go into that a little bit more as well, because I think there's often maybe a misunderstanding that the Bible sanctions the way in which people eat meat, and it certainly doesn't. And we'll have a look at that in a few seconds. And then obviously there are other motives as well, such as animal welfare and animal rights. And I don't think that people necessarily start in a path and always stay in it. Sometimes you start in a path and other paths open up. You become aware of things, like life is a voyage, isn't it really, or a journey. And then also for compassion. So, I mean, there are people like Albert Einstein, George Bernard Shaw, and just quotes there that I've included from them, that, you know, that a vegetarian diet is an evolutionary process. Or George Bernard Shaw, I love this quote from him. When asked why he was vegetarian, he says, "Oh, come on, the boot is on the other leg. Why should you call me to account for eating decently?" So it's a very nice response, actually. And I mean, Shaw was such a giant of our literature, but he's also apparently the only person who's ever won the Nobel Prize for Literature and an Oscar as well. And I just thought I'd say as an aside, and I mean, this is just something I kind of picked up from a discussion that was going on in social media, that Fintan O'Toole now, you know, the Irish Times journalist, does a lot of talks on Shaw's work, but I've heard that he doesn't really talk very much about his vegetarianism yet. It's very much something that is at the core of Shaw's identity as a writer, and I think that that's a pity. I think that one of my missions is really to discover the extent to which vegetarianism has been part of our formation as a country, and I'll get to that a little bit later as well. And for example, he's got this yes, George Bernard Shaw. Oh yeah.
From the book, the Bernard Shaw has the name.
Yes, yeah. But he was actually a writer and an Oscar winner. So, and I mean, then Shaw would be described as a vegetarian, but may have been vegan. Again, it's, you know, that's my point about saying that the term is quite broad, especially when it predates. And I mean, Shaw died in 1950, so veganism was only coined in the 1940s, so it wouldn't have been a term that would have been in broad use at the time. So this is a nice poem of his, and I think we might put it up on the website afterwards if you want to. And if we don't get around to it for whatever reason, just because we're a bit understaffed, you can always send me an email at maureen@vegetarian.ie and I'll send it on to you. And then in most societies, obviously, the consumption of human flesh is taboo. So how we make that kind of crossover to saying, well, you know, it's okay to use animals then that are very like human beings, it's an interesting question to kind of have a look at. I love this painting from Leonora Carrington. She was an artist, an Anglo-Irish artist who actually died in Mexico in 2011. And she was a vegetarian. And a lot of her, there's, I suppose, the cruelty of animals portrayed in an awful lot of her works, and there's quite an archive actually online, so it's very interesting, you know, when you go home to have a look at it, if this is the sort of thing that interests you. And here you can see that people are gathered around, they're feasting on animals, but this woman here, she's just kind of casually sticking a fork into a baby. And it kind of, I suppose, brings to the fore maybe the extent to which we find some things horrific and don't find other consumptions horrific, but we don't necessarily know why. And I suppose where religion had a monopoly, well, there was a very clear division of the soul, but obviously people don't necessarily follow that anymore, but they haven't sought to replace that division or that justification with anything else, except maybe with the faculty of reason. But, you know, as we see that's breaking down as well, the more we know about animals and their cognition. So vegetarians do oppose killing animals. And this is just a theme with me, the thing about human flesh. I'm not advocating it, by the way. But I was invited to give a talk to the UCD Law Society last November, and the proposition was that meat is murder. Now, I always find it quite difficult to talk at, you know, to give that sort of talk, because I don't want to give a hugely evangelical talk, especially when I don't know who the audience is. And then I also thought that they would be maybe quite hostile. So I thought, well, how about just have a look at the terminology. And murder, obviously, it's the intentional killing of a human being. So if you're saying that meat is murder, murder clearly isn't, it doesn't apply to animals under the current law. So I said, well, then if we look at the meaning of the word meat, it certainly would encapsulate human flesh. So I said, if meat is murder also refers to human beings, then meat is murder. I rest my case. And that was the beginning of my talk. And we won the motion. And we won it because the people they had in their opposition, they only had 2, and they were both vegetarians. And I was there, oh my goodness, I'm in a very, very changed society. There's no question about that. So the other thing too is that with genetic modification and genetic engineering, I mean, this is my area of expertise really. I did my PhD in patents on patents on biotech inventions. So this mouse with the ear, that is a genuine creation. And basically how scientists have actually done this is they take an embryo, a very, very young embryo, and they start to inject human cells into it so they can grow spare parts, if you like. They've done it with human livers, and the idea is that you take out the liver, you use it for transplantation, and you put the rest of the sheep into the food chain, not kind of making any connection by the fact that, well, blood flows through all the organs, doesn't it? And I mean, you know, an awful lot of the advances in genetic engineering was done very quietly during the declaration of war in Iraq. So, you know, it's highly political as well.
Are there any particular countries where this is allowed or not allowed, or this is? So when you did your research, you refer to a particular country, or when is this taking place?
Well, mainly in the US, because they've got most of the. But I mean, then what it means is down the line, like if you're going for tests on disease, if you're going for any sort of treatment, basically the treatment will have been based on this sort of creations, you know.
Okay.
And I mean, one of the things that, as a lawyer, I think one of the things that you can avoid is, if just supposing I was thinking ahead, right, and I was saying, well, we can't use animals the way we've been using animals traditionally for testing anymore. So how do I get around the law? Well, the law generally, at the beginning of a piece of legislation, you'll have a schedule in which you have definitions. So, for example, if I'm introducing a piece of legislation banning testing on apes, I'll have a definition of an ape, right? And if I'm being smart about it, what I'll do then is I'll create a hybrid being with genes from something else and go on testing on that being, right? And then, if I'm prosecuted, I'll just say, oh yeah, we don't test on apes anymore. We test on this lacuna. It falls outside the remit of what's described in the Act. And that's how you get around legislation. So I don't know whether that's going to happen, but, you know, certainly it's something that I've seen. And this is just a kind of a joke, but a few years ago I was deep in my PhD and having a mad moment, so I asked one of my colleagues, would you ever do a 5-way photo where you turn a mouse into me, so I'll use it in the future. And anyway, the point about it is that, and then I always use this next slide, and when I did this with an undergraduate class of 20-year-olds, there was kind of blank faces, and I then realised, okay, you know, the Marx Brothers were like, they were a bunch of comedians based in New York. I think they were from the Czech Republic originally, but they were 4 or 5 brothers. And in the days back in which Ireland had only one TV channel, Christmas Day, Marx Brothers films were fantastic. And they used to have them on New Year's Day as well, because it was a slapstick comedy that would go on for about 2 hours. Anyway, one of the brothers, he used to have these soliloquies. So he'd walk around the place asking himself questions and answering them. And one of the cuts was, am I a man or a mouse? And he answers it, and he says, throw down some cheese and you'll soon find out. And I thought that was a good kind of a, you know, that we're going to end up having a test of humanity which is based on, you know, what you eat or something like that. So anyway, talking about defining Protein-landia, I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with this sort of, you know, people eating very, very unhealthy food and then asking you, but, you know, isn't your diet very unhealthy? Whatever. So, and I just thought that I'm actually a food combiner. I know it's not very fashionable. A lot of people have this idea that, oh, well, if you eat a load of vegetables, whatever. But anyway, I come from an old tradition. became vegan a long time ago, and I read a lot on food combining. And again, I'm not a nutritionist, but I've stayed fairly healthy on that diet for a long time. And I've just got some pictures from foods around the world in which an awful lot of indigenous foods, so pre-colonial food, so before cattle were brought and before meat was used in very big quantities, this is kind of the indigenous food. So, I mean, you've got Arabic food, you've got a mix of grains and pulses. Indian food, again, mix of grains and pulses. This is a Greek dish, mix of grains and pulses, beans on toast. This is like tacos from Mexico. The top one here is an Ethiopian dish. This is Italian, Southeast Asian. I went on, I had another slide, or another set of slides. The top left here, it's a Brazilian bean stew. This is from Central America, papusas, so it's like corn stuffed with beans. This is fool from Egypt, tagines from North Africa, a garbanzo stew from Spain. This is Venezuelan arepas, and this is me in a stall in Mexico City with something very similar, blue corn and stuffed with beans. So, anyway.
Just to ask a question, if you're talking maybe about, I don't know, like 200 or 300 years ago, even whenever time, right now the restaurants or the places, they adapt I suppose, I don't know, like you go to a restaurant and you ask, do you have a veggie menu, do you have a vegan menu? I suppose in this type of cultures, like I've been to Mexico and I lived in Guatemala, and in Guatemala, in many places they eat these beans and rice, and they have, I mean, for them even to eat meat is kind of expensive.
Yeah.
And so I suppose my question to you, do you think that maybe in the old civilizations they had this type of diet without having a request? Because I think the problem right now is that there is always a demand and an offer. And if you have, for example, like in London or other places, they have more vegan restaurants because there is a higher demand.
Yeah.
Maybe in Ireland there are not as many because people are not demanding.
The statistic from the Restaurant Association of Ireland, which is a conservative organisation, is that, and I got this from, it was reported in the Examiner this year, their estimation is that between 10 and 15% of restaurant customers now request a vegan or a vegetarian option. So it's way over what we would estimate the number of people to be. There are a lot of people who are curious.
But even though if it's like this, then why is this not being translated into having more?
Oh, it is. It is being translated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even
I mean,
2 years ago there wasn't that many places.
Exactly.
Like I moved to Dublin 2 years ago and I became vegan 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Like in the last year,
Yeah.
the increase in restaurants, the increase in menus is
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like
Oh, wow.
they're responding to it
Yeah,
so quickly.
they are. And and I mean, even for example, the local enterprise office where I live in Galway told me in January that they had just helped to bring 3 vegan products to market. I was in the milk market in Limerick yesterday. There are 2 all vegan stalls. There's a third that's almost all vegan, like it's vegetarian, nearly all vegan. Actually, no, make that. There's another one then, it's sweet. So basically 7 places off the top of my head where I could get vegan that was produced in a place that had no meat.
Wow.
So it's exploding. Absolutely. I think you're probably in the minority now if you don't have some offering. Milano's has just introduced a vegan menu. I mean, if I went on, do you know what I mean? Like in the last month, there have been a huge number of strides. Huge. Absolutely huge. So what I'm saying here is that I think if you look at indigenous cultures and what they eat, you always find this combination of grains and a pulse. So I'm not a nutritionist, but I think there's a wisdom, in a whole host of, if you look across the world and you see this, that it constantly repeating itself, that there's got to be something in it. Sorry now. Yeah. So then, just a brief aside, because this is a question that often comes up, and it's something that I thought about over the last few weeks, and so this might be useful. So there's often, and this often gets discussed on social media as well, that people ask, aren't we doing huge destruction to the Amazon, consuming all that soya? Well, the first thing is that look at Provamel's soya milk, and they now have on the front of it that the soya is grown in Europe. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that soya is obviously a tiny percentage of soya milk. So if you've got a litre of soya milk, it's about 7% soybean, right? And then I just started to think, well, how much do we weigh? So the average weight of a cow is 500, it can be up to 700 kilos, and the average weight of a human being, and like that's taken as an average across the world, is about 65 kilos. How many cows and people in Ireland? We've got approximately 6.7 million cows. And if anybody says, oh, that's a rubbish statistic, well, it's from the Central Statistics Office, because I think it helps if you're making claims to back them up with a conservative, reputable source. Approximately 4.8 million people. And, sorry now, what was my, yeah, oh yeah, there I had it. So again, I found it very difficult to find out exactly what weight of food cows eat a day. I found all sorts of different reports. Very conservative estimate would be about 10 kg. Up to 18 kg I found much higher, and I thought, okay, well, play conservative. So humans would eat about a quarter of what a cow would eat. And then the animals weigh more, there are more of them. So obviously vegetarianism really helps with the maths, and perhaps it is the case that meat eaters who make spurious claims about veggie soya consumption just can't actually add up the maths. A lot more cows, they're a lot heavier, they eat more, and also a lot of the soya that humans use can now be grown in Europe. And like the cattle ranching obviously is you know, it's a main cause of the destruction of the Amazon. Then the question is, why would you look for rights? Well, I suppose because we do live in a pluralistic society. I'm not sure that there's a general awareness of that at present, especially when you've got organisations from the government coming out and saying, well, you have to eat this or you have to eat that. Societies have never really lived like that. And I mean, I think if you look at a lot of societies that have got mixed ethnicities, you're going to find an awful lot of different food cultures. And I'm not sure that it's helpful to try and force in one direction, because if we try and force in one direction, well then can't we also be forced in a different direction? Now the thing about it is that if you look for rights, recognition would mean mandatory respect for our beliefs. That obviously would then mean that we have to afford a similar respect. And I mean, I think that that's right. Otherwise you're evangelizing, you're seeking to convert everyone, and you might be unsuccessful, or you might find yourself being forced to adopt another belief system. It could also mean the provision of appropriate food in public places, especially raising awareness of in society. So evangelizing would certainly be allowed. And then it would help to stop misleading advertising, like using the use of parmesan on so-called vegetarian pasta, hidden fish sauce in vegan curries, etc. So the first port of call as a source of rights is the Constitution. And those, the recognition of any sort of such rights would be under Article 44. Now this is on the right to protect or to practice one's religion. And to practice with a C. I should have written that with an S. My apologies. So maybe I've got a bit of a defect in my own diet. So then a lot of people, when they see this, first of all, they think, oh, well, surely vegetarianism isn't a religion. And of course, I'm not comparing it to a religion. But what I am saying is that this is generally the framework under which certain rights pertaining to beliefs are protected. So the issue, I suppose, the development of the recognition of freedom to practice one's religion in Ireland it's been developed. Actually, there was a big case in the 1980s or the 1990s on the Sabbath day. So when Sunday trading wasn't allowed, that obviously it was influenced by canon law. It was influenced by Christianity, that you wouldn't trade on a Sunday. And then there were other groups that they had a different Sabbath. So they would close maybe on a Friday or close on a Saturday, and then be prohibited by the state law to open on a Sunday, meaning that they were losing 2 instead of 1 trading day a year. And so there was a recognition of the right to practice one's religion. And so if your religion obliged you to not work on a Friday or a Saturday, you were then given an exception to that legislation, so you were allowed to open on a Saturday. So then, would vegetarianism be protected akin to a religion within the Constitution? Maybe. But you probably wouldn't make a claim actually under that legislation because there are others. And when I'm not giving a direct answer, it's just simply because law is all shades of grey. There's very little that's actually black and white. How it would apply, we get an awful lot of questions about parents concerned that their vegetarian children are being obliged to cook meat dishes for state examinations, and that is illegal. It definitely is. There is a way to handle it, though, and it's probably better off not to get confrontational unless the school is. And we have had a few cases in which the schools have just dug their heels in. We're always happy to advise then, behind the scenes on how to actually handle that. A lack of provision of vegetarian or vegan food in public bodies such as hospitals, prisons and schools. And I mean, in fairness here, certainly from an overview that I've got from talking to a lot of people, hospitals tend to be extremely helpful if they can. And obviously there are a lot of vegans and vegetarians now who are actually working there. So I've generally heard quite positive reports on that. Obviously there are exceptions, but I think we're making progress in that regard. I think the issue of unhealthy food in hospitals is an issue that affects everyone. It's not just us, but hopefully we can make some sort of a positive contribution towards that as well. The other font of rights really are the Equality Acts, which prohibit discrimination on 9 grounds, including religion, and that would also encapsulate ethical beliefs. So, for example, if you've got work or school infringing on your beliefs, the body to go to really is the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, because they're the guardians of the Equality Acts. You can't discriminate in services or employment on 9 grounds, and that includes vegetarianism and veganism. And I have a friend who has had correspondence from them saying that yes, veganism and vegetarianism are protected beliefs. They are anyway. We knew that, but I mean, it's very nice to actually have confirmation from them on that.
Sorry, would that include also for because I want to go to medical school and I'm very scared that they're going to force me to make a test on non-human animals.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I know that there's the declaration of consciousness, and I've used that before in my biology, and I've taken that and then okay, for ethical reasons you don't want to do this. Yeah. But there is a fear of actually being told if you don't do this, if you don't test this animal, you don't get any of your marks or whatever.
I think that's an area that's probably in development at the moment. You can't be forced to do something, but at the same time, I'm unsure of the effect that would have on the final award. So I would actually get in touch with the certifying body and ask them their position on it.
One thing that maybe you could have mentioned is to do with the asylum seekers, because obviously, as you know, many of the asylum seekers, obviously, in some of the centres, they can cook. I think in some of them they can. And for example, in places where they have to eat the food that is given to them. I mean, I suppose, I know, for example, in prisons, and I think you're right, that's probably good. But my question is that, for example, what the asylum seeker says many times is that someone is feeding them with food that comes from the state. But
I'm not finished. I'm going to answer that question.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
So, sorry, the second,
Sorry, just about the ethical beliefs, wouldn't they say, the meat eaters, that they have this right as well?
Yes. I'm going to get to it. Okay.
Can we leave questions until the end of the talk?
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm kind of jumping ahead and jumping back. But I'll deal with all that. That is actually a concern as well. So just bear with me. The second port of call is the European Convention on Human Rights, and that's kind of I suppose been. I suppose it's like the root of the equality legislation, because the equality legislation is much more recent. So we signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights in 2003. Now, just a clarification, it's from the Council of Europe, which is a different body to the EU. So it binds 47 member states. So it's the EU plus. One of the worrying things about Britain is that they keep on talking about pulling out of this because they don't like, they say, having judges in Europe telling them what they should and shouldn't be doing in terms of their rights. So just basically Article 9 is the article that's of particular interest. So everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. It's a right to change your belief or religion, and then you can manifest your religion in teaching, practice and observance. And then you always have rights which are a little bit circumscribed. So obviously you can't break public order, health, morals, etc. If there's a contradiction in Ireland between the Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights, the Constitution wins because the legislation was passed underneath the Constitution. Now, I think that that was for another purpose altogether. It was the whole right to life issue, which was very strongly protected in the Irish Constitution and not so strongly protected in the European Convention. And it was a way as well, I suppose, of dealing with any issues which were going to come up, that were dealt with in the referendum. Now, in the UK, the European Convention has been applied to veganism, and generally speaking, in an interpretation of one country, it should be used as a guide for other countries. So their incarnation of the European Convention on Human Rights is in the Human Rights Act 1998. The first case there in the heading is a 1992 case in which there was a prisoner and he didn't want to work in the print works. The print works included, I think there were animal products in the dyes. He said that he didn't want to work with them. Now, he was obliged to work with them because there's always a balance between like the work that could be provided. But what was important about that case is it recognised that veganism was a protected right under the European Convention. But again, as I say, there's always going to be a balance. Environmentalism has also been protected under this Article 9. So, for example, if you were against flying and your boss was obliging you to take a helicopter at high environmental cost and stuff like that, you could seek, it's a kind of a conscientious objection, if you like. And anti-hunting as well has also been recognised. Now, to answer your question, a rejected interpretation was obviously hunting with hounds was banned in the UK in, I think it was 2003. And so the Countryside Alliance took a case, an Article 9 case, seeking to establish that they had a belief in fox hunting, and that was rejected. Rightly so, because otherwise you could have a belief in anything. Well, I believe I should be able to, to beat people up. And is that a protected belief? Oh, well, it's my religion. Shouldn't I be able to manifest it? Do you see what I mean? Now, there is a concern, actually, that if what I was saying earlier about, we live in a pluralist society, it's probably a better model than if you start pushing in a direction of conversion, because the minute you do that, you're going to have a counter-conversion. And I don't think it's, so I don't think it would be a particularly good way to go, but, as I say, this was the pushback, an Article 9 right. And you see, that is open to a judge because the language is very, very open. So an interpretation, it can go either way. It depends on who gets convinced, who argues what. So there is some case law then from the European Court of Human Rights. There are two cases, Jakobski versus Poland. This was a 2010 case in which a prisoner had not been provided with vegetarian food. He sued and he was given compensation of €3,000. Now, there's some background to the case which is actually quite amusing. Apparently, a lot of prisoners were planning to convert to Buddhism because the vegetarian food was apparently a lot better. So they mightn't have actually had the money for that. So it's just something to bear in mind. And there was a similar case in Romania in 2013. Buddhist prisoners, inmates' rights of religion and conscience under Article 9 were infringed when he was refused the provision of a vegetarian diet. I think that's actually quite interesting because the religion doesn't oblige you to follow a vegetarian diet. Buddhism is actually very open, so it's a diet associated with a belief. But anyway, he got 3,200 in compensation. There is a vulnerability here because currently there is no legally recognised definition of vegetarianism or veganism. So if the courts are seeking to look for a definition, where are they going to look? Are they going to go to the societies, or are they going to go and water it down a bit? And for example, if you look at the definition of what's organic, organic products are allowed to have a little bit of conventional products in them. Like there's not really, I suppose, a requirement of absolute purity. So that is a bit of a concern. And then the other thing too is the Vegan Society, they have a system of self-certification. So it's the companies actually saying, well, these are the ingredients. And then, for example, if you've got a vegan product that's deep fried with in the same deep fryer as fish, the Vegan Society doesn't withdraw certification because it's the product itself and not the means of production. So that would be another, I suppose, a thing to look at. Anyhow, there is a danger of the terminology being watered down. And just remember that the rights are a shield and not a sword. So they're defensive and they're not actually allowing you to, to go, I suppose, and forcibly change. So do we have a right to challenge other religions' ritual slaughter, for example? And we've seen ritual slaughter challenged in some European countries, not on the basis of, or not on the grounds of, vegetarianism or veganism, but probably in secularism, or, for example, conscientious objection to taxes being used to subsidise animal farming, which is, I certainly think, it's an area which could be explored because, years ago I lived in Spain and Spain had military service and conscientious objection was allowed. Like if you didn't want to engage in that, you were allowed to do something else. So it may be that we could look at that, to ask for or a portion of taxes that are going towards subsidising farming practices that we don't agree with being used for other ecological practices, for example. Would we then be able to challenge also because there are secular slaughter practices also, obviously. There's a question then whether animals could be brought in with the scope of protection of religion, because the received wisdom is at the moment, I suppose, is that the Bible sanctions the use of animals for food, because a lot of people just quote Genesis, well, God gave the world to the mankind in common and that's it, you could do whatever you want. But there are a lot of misreadings, I think, mistranslations and misinterpretations, and then a huge change in farming practices also. There's a professor at the Oxford Centre of Animal Ethics, Andrew Lindsay, who has spent his whole academic career on interpreting the Bible to read it so that it doesn't actually sanction the mass slaughter that's actually taking place. And for example, I think it's very unlikely that any religion sanctions industrialised farming. Like when you look at the statistics from the recent floods in North Carolina and their outcome, I think there were about 5,500 pigs drowned, but they were locked in. They weren't even allowed out because apparently if you lock in the pigs, then you're able to make an insurance claim, whereas if they're left out. So it's a complete commercial entity. And the other thing too is that practice would be very much based on the idea that, well, animals are property, so they're unthinking beings. And I think that there is something wrong in that, We know that they're sentient. We know that they have a good deal of intelligence, so probably they've got some estimation of what's coming down the line. You could argue, of course, that it's not necessarily a much worse death than the one they would have had. But there were over 3 million chickens suffered this. 4.2 million. Yeah. And anyway, so the treatment of all God's creatures, I don't think the Bible is saying that's okay. So, and what I'm saying is that I obviously observe an awful lot of these debates on social media. So I think it's kind of useful to sort of rethink about the basis on which people sort of justify practices like this and say, well, there's no consequence because it's sanctioned by my belief system or whatever. It may not be sanctioned by your belief system. And in terms of the law and how it applies, well, you're a person with rights or a piece of property without rights, basically. And, the law always claims it's built on reason. So the reasonable man is one of the first kind of figures that you come across when you do a law degree. And I just think it's interesting to just scratch at the surface of that logic. So who's a legal person? And people will automatically respond, well, all human beings. And that's certainly not the case. The Irish weren't regarded as human beings for a long time. There's an article from Punch's magazine in the 1820s which said we were the missing link between human beings and gorillas. And then, the Aboriginals weren't classified, they weren't counted in the census in Australia until 1967. So before that they had been seen as flora and fauna. But obviously they're inanimate and natural objects that do have corporate personality. So, I mean, companies, for the purposes of the European Convention on Human Rights, have a right to own property, they have a right to privacy, and they have a right to protection against defamation. There's now legal personhood for rivers and trees. The River Whanganui in New Zealand has been recognised as a person. Now, if that seems to be very odd, it's a device. It's a device so that if you pollute the river can sue, rather than you having to go downstream and find the people who were affected by it, prove that they were affected by that pollution. But anyway, how it works is that if you pollute the river, there are obviously trustees of the river that will take a case, like you would in the case of protecting the rights of a child, for instance, that they can't represent themselves in court, so you have guardians. It's a similar sort of a legal structure. So are animals less than rivers and plants then? And Stephen Wise is a fairly eminent lawyer in the US. He's a practitioner, not an academic, and he's seeking to have apes recognised in New York as persons under habeas corpus, so they've got a right to appear in court and have their case for freedom made for them. And he's beginning to be heard by the courts. He's taken a number of cases, and he had a recent case in which there was a dissenting judge. So the majority of the judges still were saying, we can't actually intervene here, we need an intervention of the legislator. But the dissenting judge said that he had changed his view in the last 2 years, and that these animals certainly are not things. So they should be taken out of that status. So, we're seeing, and this is like it's an excerpt from a picture from the New York Times a few years ago. Tommy is one of the apes on whose behalf Stephen has taken the case, and that's me with him during the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics conference this year, in which he was the keynote speaker. So the relevance is that if animals are persons, can we continue to eat them and use them as if they were property? I put a question mark there, because you see, the law can always be changed about the way in which we use things. So don't take anything for granted, just because if we extend personhood, it might actually weaken rights. And I think that's one of the big concerns of a lot of human rights lawyers, is that we've come this far. There are a lot of human beings who don't have rights, so let's wait until we get that right. But I don't think that that's necessarily a good argument. I think that sometimes, you don't wait until you have full rights for indigenous communities to then start agitating for children's rights. You can do the two simultaneously, and sometimes you've got a raising of consciousness across the board. And then there are a need for clear definitions of vegetarian and veganism from the EU, but who sets this agenda really has to be proceeded with caution. There's a third source then, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, Article 10. And again, if and when Brexit goes ahead, there's a big question mark. I wouldn't say that these rights will be bolstered. They will probably be weakened. And then the other thing too about this is that the Charter only became legally binding since the Treaty of Lisbon, so it's still pretty new. So from what I've seen, the call for rights for vegans and vegetarians is still emanating from the European Convention as opposed to from the Charter. And the other benefit of the Convention is, as I said, because it's from the Council of Europe, it covers 47 states. The European Union Charter only covers 28. Then there is a regulation that obliges the Commission to introduce legislation about suitability of food for vegans and vegetarians. And one of the things you probably have noticed in a lot of restaurants in the last year or so is the list of allergens. That was sort of a stepping stone to what they're doing. I went into one restaurant not so long ago, and I asked them, could they identify the foods that were vegans and vegetarians, and I got a booklet this size, and I was sort of told to figure it out. So, yeah, anyway, it was a Southeast Asian restaurant, and I'm there. What's so difficult about doing a stir-fry with soya sauce? I don't know. Anyway, so that's coming soon. The legal definition is planned for 2020. And then there's just some little bit more information on the regulation. There is this argument that Ireland will never be vegetarian. That's really fake news. We've got a long history of vegetarianism. It's there since our independence. I mean, Mary Robinson, I don't think she's vegetarian, but she's certainly advocating that everybody else should adopt a vegetarian diet for the environment. The Irish Farm Produce Cafe was allegedly a vegetarian establishment, from what I've been able to ascertain. And it was the site of the signing of the Proclamation of the Republic, and I've put a reference to that where I got that information from, which I thought was very interesting. But actually, when you go back to look at the profiles of a lot of the people who agitated for independence, a lot of them would have been interested in other social movements at the time, such as feminism and the rights of animals. To continue our work at the Vegetarian Society, we really do need some volunteers. We need a secretary because we have nobody scheduling meetings at the moment. We meet once a month on Skype, and we're kind of flexible. We can reorganise that, and if you can't come, there's no problem. But it would be very handy to have a secretary, so that would schedule meetings, just take minutes, and, for example, doing stuff like booking this venue annually. And it's our 40th birthday this year, and thank you very much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed the festival. So, any questions? Yeah. Well, maybe talk to Martin. Is that okay? Because I won't be here for the whole day.
Well, I think membership is online as well, so if you go online, you'll see or send one of us an email.
Yeah, we're pretty good actually about manning the inbox now at the moment. So, yeah.
Can I just go back to my
Sure.
question about if we argue that one of our beliefs to not kill animals, to not eat any animal products, how could they meat eaters say, oh no, but it's my belief, I need to eat, then we would go back to prove, okay, humankind doesn't need animal products to survive. How we would argue if it is?
Not necessarily. If you want to get protection for a belief system, first of all, you have to show that it is a recognised belief. I mean, I can't come along and start smoking pot and say, I'm a pot smoker, and it's a deep religious belief for me, so I want a constitutional right to be able to go out and do it in the street and do it in the schools, and you can't do anything you want, right? So there are certain tests. So there would be a test for what a belief system is, and generally what they look at is there a group of people who have been practicing, this particular belief system over a period of time. Obviously, there's always the issue of whether it's damaging to the community. I mean, for example, there's a very good example actually, the recognition of ethnicity or the ethnic status that was given as a recognition to members of the travelling community, in Ireland. That had been recognised in the UK years ago. And what they said was the judge gave an absolutely massive test. So he was saying that it's very, very simple. If you come along and you say, well, for example, do you recognise that in the Ukraine that Russians would be an ethnic minority? Well, that's very clear because you've got people who originated from a different place, they speak a similar language. That would be very easy to establish. It's a bit more difficult to establish something that's unfamiliar, like an eating practice, or an eating practice that comes from a belief system about the way in which we treat animals. So if the court was doing a good job, or the lawyers in the case were doing a good job, they would call witnesses, so experts who were able to come along and to give testimony about that. So you can't just
Wouldn't they just say that it was part of the culture, Because
what culture?
Yeah, I am
No,
from
but
Brazil, and it's so strong that the culture, about eating meat there, especially in my state. Yeah, it's the culture is to go barbecues, a piece of meat on the floor, these kind of things. So they assume that as part of the culture of the state.
Yeah, but the European Convention on Human Rights is not protecting culture under Article 9. It's protecting a belief system. So certainly you could have a group of people that would come along and start, I don't know, barbecue on Sunday to celebrate farming. And they could try that. And it really would be up to the evidence. But, I mean, you can't just come along, as I said, and just say, oh, well, it's my belief X, Y, or Z, and I want a protection under Article 9. I mean, it's not a superficial piece of legislation. And the judges that decide, I mean, you mightn't agree with all the decisions that they come up with, but they are relatively eminent. You know, they've been in the job, and they take the convention pretty seriously. So it's not a trivial piece of legislation. So when they recognise environmentalism, you could imagine that, well, for example, I imagine that anybody who was resisting a work practice based on environmental beliefs, there is an organisation, it's a group of solicitors in the UK called the Environmental Law Foundation. So there are about 30 solicitors that specialise in environmental environmental protection, environmental cases. So, for example, if I were seeking to have a belief recognised in a courtroom, then I would go to them because they're experts, they're specialists, they know the law inside out, and they'd be able to cite an awful lot of other cases. Now, just supposing, in your example, well, just supposing there was a group of people who had barbecues every Sunday seeking to get their belief protected. The first thing, who are they going to get to represent them if there's no expertise? They might build it up across generations, but, you know, I think I've answered it in the sense of the Countryside Alliance tried to get a recognised belief in fox hunting. And I mean, fox hunting has been in the culture, in particular classes of society, for centuries. But it wasn't believed because the purpose of taking the case was to subvert the legislation which had banned fox hunting. So I mean, sometimes I suppose it's recognised that society goes in a particular direction, advances if you like, and people try to resist that. I mean, it would be like saying, well, you know, we want to go back to the days of women having to give up their jobs when they got married. So do we make that a belief system and seek to have, you know, certain rights restricted? The courts aren't going to accept that, probably. But it's always, as I say, it's always a grey area, so you have to be aware of it. Yeah?
Sorry, I wanted to just add to that, because it's like, nobody's like stopping people from eating flesh, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, it is like the mainstream society.
Yes.
It's literally like these equal rights. It's kind of like saying like, well, I need rights because I'm straight, and like there's too many gay people now that are out. It's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the mainstream is straight.
Yeah.
And I think like, isn't there also like an aspect of the fact that like consequences on somebody else, like I can hate children and be like, well, you know, I can rape children because I just hate them, you know?
Yeah.
Like that doesn't matter because it has an impact on somebody else.
Now, you raise a very good point, and this is just something that I was reading up on during the summer, and I thought, okay, this is an area that's very problematic. You know, there was a case in Northern Ireland of, now, I might be a bit vague on the facts, but there was a baker, and I think he claimed to be Christian, and there was a gay couple, and they wanted a cake made, and I think the outcome is that he pretty much has to make the cake. And I saw a critique of that, and they said, it's one thing not receiving your customers, it's another thing being obliged to provide for them, because what if there was a group that was like, of, you know, your imaginary barbecuists came to a vegan restaurant and said, I have a right to eat meat, and you have to cook it for me. Now, the thing is that I did say, though, that the rights are a shield, they're not a sword. So I think you have to be very careful about what you wish for, because if you take it in a non-pluralistic sense, then that can come back and bite you. Do you know? So I suppose what vegans are looking for really is space, you know, in a pluralistic society. And then evangelizing later. But anyway.